Hey everybody, and welcome to the first video for Chapter 13, the Byzantine Empire. This is also the first video for Period 3. We're moving into the next period in the AP curriculum. With Period 3, we'll be dealing with regional and trans-regional interactions. This goes from about the year 600 up until 1450 or so. So let's jump first into the Byzantine Empire. A little background. So we remember from the previous chapter, actually chapter 11 specifically, about Diocletian's split of the old Roman Empire. All right, he divided it into two, where you have the West and the East. And eventually the Roman emperors started to concentrate a lot more on the East. And this was mostly because of the wealth of the East. Okay, trade and urban centers were much more prominent on the East than they were on the West. And a big area of trade was this city here, Byzantium. Byzantium was a Greek trade city, and its geographic location led to expansion. You see a zoom in here where you've got this is a modern day one, obviously, where it's called Istanbul, the capital of Turkey. But you've got the Black Sea and this strait here, the Bosphorus, that empties out into the Sea of Marmara, and then you've got another strait here, the Dardanelles, that would empty out into the Aegean, and then that goes into the Mediterranean. So trade between Central Asia and the Mediterranean largely went through Byzantium, and that's a reason why Constantine decided to rename it for himself, Constantinople, and it became the capital of the Eastern Empire. It also turned it into the wealthiest city in Europe throughout the Middle Ages, right? It became known as the window to the West. You know, today it's kind of, not sure whether we would consider it to be Europe or Asia, but back in those days, because the Byzantines really claimed this Roman heritage, it was still considered Europe. So they did consider themselves to be Roman, even though it was largely based on Greek heritage. They looked at themselves as being the inheritors of Augustus and the Roman tradition. So during the early days, they didn't even refer to themselves as the Byzantine Empire. They just referred to themselves as the Roman Empire. Even after the quote-unquote Roman Empire of the West had fallen in 476, the emperors in Constantinople and most of their subjects still referred to themselves as Roman. Most of them did not speak or even know Latin. They had very little connection back with the old Roman heritage, but they still referred to themselves as Roman. Now, they dominated the Mediterranean, through the control of the trade, through Alexandria, through Constantinople, through the Greek city-states as well. You look at the map here, this was the Eastern Roman Empire. The Western one, right before it fell, was really just Italy and a little surrounding areas. And then you've got these Germanic states, the Visigoths, the Franks up around here. You'll have the Ostrogoths to the north. They would eventually really start coming down and push their way into Italy. And then over here, you also have the Sassanid Empire. They were kind of the later version of the Persian Empire. Once they were able to stabilize the border with the Sassanids and halt their expansion, the Eastern Roman Empire didn't really have to worry too much about foreign invasion. The Black Sea and the Balkan Peninsula protected them from these Germanic invasions that were really threatening the West. And so they were not bothered by the Huns and the Visigoths and the Ostrogoths and the rest of them that were coming in and just destroying the Western Empire. Okay, a bit about Byzantine politics. Now, it was highly centralized. Power was completely in the hands of the emperor. You see the emperor above all other figures here. And the emperor would put on a show of the high life. It was meant, when you showed up into the court of the Byzantine emperor, you were expected to be awed in his presence. They were expected to supplicate before him. And beginning with Constantine, they implemented this policy known as Caesaropapism. Christianity ended the divine nature of the emperor. So Constantine, and Theodosius and other emperors, after they officially converted to Christianity, they can no longer claim to be a god the way that Augustus and Nero and Caligula did. But they took a very, very active role in church affairs and placed themselves above everybody else within the Eastern Christian hierarchy. There was no separation between church and state within the Eastern Empire. Eventually, it really turned the Byzantine Empire into a theocracy. Now, Byzantine bureaucracy became kind of synonymous with this large, complex bureaucracy. The term Byzantine has come to mean an unnecessarily complex organization or bureaucracy. And you see this picture here where, it shows two aspects of it. One, just all of the different officials, whether they were government or military, kind of being, answering to the emperor in the middle. But also down at the bottom, people were expected to be completely subservient to the emperor. They were expected to prostrate themselves, to kneel before him when they saw him at all times. They considered themselves slaves to the emperor, much more even than servants. The emperor considered himself equal to God in his authority. So really, even though he was not a divine figure per se, he was on such a high level that he was way above everybody else within the bureaucratic system. Now, probably the most famous of the emperors of the truly Byzantine era was Justinian. Justinian, you see him here, kind of, again, putting himself above all others within the religious hierarchy. He ruled from 527 to 565, and he was not born into royalty. He was actually born into very humble means, and he ruled with his wife Theodora. They were both, in some ways, kind of like co-rulers, both very shrewd and pragmatic individuals. And Theodora actually was the one who told him not to flee the city when a huge riot broke out between the Blues and the Greens. The Blues and the Greens, we'll talk a little bit more about them later. They were fan factions of the chariot races, and a huge riot broke out. Think of them as like soccer hooligans times a million. And it destroyed big sections of the city, and it cost thousands of lives. And Theodora told Justinian, send the troops and really put them down. And then in rebuilding the city, he had the opportunity to rebuild it in his image. And the most famous example of this was the Hagia Sophia. The Hagia Sophia, the Church of the Holy Wisdom, has become this iconic image of Byzantine architecture. It was built as a church. It's now a mosque since the Islamic takeover in 1400s. But still a classic example of Byzantine architecture that really kind of sets it apart from old Roman architecture and certainly later medieval European architecture that we'll look at a little bit later. Now, probably Justinian's most impressive accomplishment was Justinian's Code. This was the definitive codification of Roman law. It was written in Latin, trying to make that connection back with the old Roman law, but it preserved Roman law to be used in Europe later. Whereas Roman law was forgotten by many in Western Europe during the early period of the Middle Ages, it was preserved in the East and then would later be adopted by Western Europe later on. And if Justinian had not preserved it, who knows if that would have ever happened. Now, he wanted to conquer a lot of the old territory of the old empire, and he sent his brilliant general Belisarius out to do so. And you see the dark orange where the empire had its ascension in 527. By the time he died, he had, claimed a lot of the old Western Empire back for Rome, including the entire Italian peninsula, large sections of North Africa, even the bottom of Spain. Now, this didn't last very long, and, it really showed the inability of the Byzantines to hold on to Western European land, showed that the old empire was done. Western Europe was starting to evolve into something very different because of the Germanic invasions, and the Eastern Empire was evolving into something very different. Right? We already talked about how it was very heavily Greek centric as opposed to Latin centric. So they were just moving in two opposite directions. Christianity, they were moving in opposite directions, and it just showed that Justinian's dream of recreating the empire like the days of Augustus was just not to be. Now, a threat and a rivalry was developing within the Middle East from the ascension of Islam. The Islamic Empire expanded very, very quickly in the 7th century. We'll talk more about this in a later chapter. But you look at the map here, the dark brown around in the Arabian Peninsula was the Muslim lands under during Muhammad's life in 632. And you see within 30 years later how quickly they expanded. They conquered Egypt, Mesopotamia. The Sassanid Empire was toppled by them. The Byzantine Empire had lost all of its land in Syria and the Middle East. They even attacked Constantinople a couple times, once in the 7th century, once in the 8th century. They would have succeeded probably too if the Byzantines had not used a incendiary device known as Greek fire, a very effective incendiary device that would burn ships on the water and remain burning even on the surface of the water. So kind of cool. Now, this loss of territory to the Islamic Empire actually turned into a good thing because it made the empire more manageable. They implemented this thing called the theme system. We'll talk more about the theme system in a later video, but it was basically dividing it up into military districts, and overall it strengthened the empire, and it led to expansion later on in the 10th and 11th centuries. You see this map of the Byzantine Empire in 1025, and it's broken down into provinces known as themes. And you can see some of the areas that they were able to reconquer. Yeah, they controlled the Aegean with Greece and Anatolia, but a little bit down into Syria, they reconquered Antioch and even the bottom of the boot in Italy. Now, relations with Western Europe were not very good, and a lot of this had to do with tensions over church authority. As I said before, in the Eastern Empire, Caesaropapism made the emperor completely above all bishops and patriarchs and people like that. It clearly put him above all Eastern Church authority. Whereas in the West, the Pope positioned himself even above kings. You see here this coronation of Pope Clementine. You've got religious figures there, kind of, crowning him, but you've also got secular kings involved with it. And this would lead to a lot of conflict between popes and kings in Western Europe. You didn't have that conflict in the Eastern Empire because of Caesaropapism. The emperor was above everybody else. But it also created tension between these two sides. The Pope felt that he should be above all Christianity, including the East, and the emperor felt that he was the emperor, and who is the Pope, who was just a bishop of Rome to tell him what to do. So they didn't really get along because of that. The Byzantines also resented, they looked down upon these barbarian Germanic states. You look at what Europe was looking like in the days after Rome fell. You've got the, what they considered to be the Roman Empire here in the east, but then you've got the Ostrogoths, the Visigoths, the Franks, and so forth. So they had these barbarians that were taking over the lands that were the old Roman Empire. And the Byzantines weren't very happy about that. They were particularly unhappy when the Pope decided to start crowning some of these barbarians Holy Roman Emperor. We'll talk about that in a later chapter in the year 800 when Charlemagne was crowned the Holy Roman Emperor. And he said, who is the Pope to do this to some bearded barbarian when we're the true inheritors of Rome? Yeah, so it really established this long simmering rivalry and tension between the two, and they would never really get on the same page with it. Okay, so that kind of wraps it up for a bit of an introduction about the Byzantine Empire, and in the next one we will talk about Byzantine economy and society.